With our Tekno EB48 2.0 buggy now taking shape, it's time to finish up on the chassis with its various mounting brackets for electronics. Although before we do that, we need to get through the next two bags, L and M, front and rear shock assembly. Bag L contains the front shock kit. Lots of small parts in this, so take care to empty its contents, making sure nothing is left behind in the bag. The shocks are basically the same as the previous version of the buggy with only some slight differences. The shock bodies and shafts are the same, front and rear. The springs are the same length as the previous generation too, although with blue rate springs up front this time. We have some nice aluminum shock caps with new inserts so that the caps last longer too. You'll need some thread lock for the bleed screw as well as some O-ring grease for this bag, so with those to hand, let's get started. With the main shock body in hand, place the black rubber O-ring around the top threads, making sure it seats nicely down into the groove. Next we can reach for our dowel ring pieces as well as the shock O-rings. Before inserting these, I like to place a dab of grease around the inside here, after which the small hat washer goes in with the hat facing upwards. Then we want to apply some grease to an O-ring before inserting it on top, followed by the center washer, another greased O-ring, and finally the larger hat washer with the hat facing downwards. I like to apply a small amount of Loctite to threads here, only a very small amount though, too much and you won't get it back off, before screwing down the cap, just so it's snug holding everything in place. Don't over tighten just yet as we want to get the shock shaft through first. Talking of the shock shaft, we need to attach our shock piston. Notice how it's flat on one side and tapered on the other. You'll want the flat side at the top for quicker rebound, used when the buggy is run on smooth surfaces, or turn it over with the tapered side on top for quicker compression, so for bumpier conditions. When you've decided which way to run your pistons, grip the shock shaft with your shock tool and drop the piston into position. Then lock into place with a zinc lock nut. Don't over tighten here. The piston is plastic and you don't want to crack, squash or expand it. I generally tighten so that there's no movement in the piston, but you can just about turn it with your fingers. Before inserting it into the shock body, apply some grease to the threads to prevent it from tearing the O-rings. Before pushing through the body, and then wipe off any excess grease once through. With the shaft through, we can now tighten up the shock cartridge, where the shock tool comes to the rescue yet again. Making sure the shock shaft is nice and smooth, we can go ahead and drop on a shock boot. Don't try to stretch it over the rod end afterwards. And then grip with the shock tool again and proceed to install the rod end. You want to make sure the rod ends on all four shocks go on the same amount. You don't want to end up with different sized shocks because the rod ends have been screwed on different levels. So take it all the way before popping a pivot ball through the rod end and making sure the ball moves freely. If it doesn't, you need to back the rod end off a little. Finally, we can install the shock collar, pop an O-ring into the groove, apply a touch of grease, and go ahead and screw it onto the shock body. With one shock complete, we need to go ahead and create the second front shock too. So O-ring on shock body, hat washer, greased O-ring, washer, another greased O-ring, final hat washer, and the top cap. Then we drop the piston onto the shock shaft and tighten with the lock nut, grease the end, and insert into the body, drop on a boot, secure the rod end, popping a pivot ball into place, before attaching the shock collar with its O-ring in place. With that done, we're ready to fill the shocks with oil. These are front shocks, so we'll need the 550 CST bottle handy. Okay, so go ahead and proceed to fill the shock with oil. I like to go halfway, then move the shock shaft up and down a little to get rid of any air trapped beneath, taking care not to push the piston above the oil fill level. Then go ahead and fill the remainder of the shock body to the top, after which we pump the shock shaft from bottom to top around 5 times. At this point I like to place the shock to one side and proceed to complete the same process on the second shock, so fill with oil and pump the shock shaft a few times. Letting the shock sit for a few minutes, we can go ahead and prepare the caps, and all that needs doing here is to insert a rubber O-ring into the far end of the cap. After which we can install the tiny O-ring into the bleed screw. The best way I've found to do this is to coat the O-ring with a drop of shock oil to help prevent a tear, and then push the bleed screw onto it, before pushing the O-ring down onto the bottom of the screw. With that done, back to our shocks now. Proceed to screw the cap into the shock body by hand, taking care not to cross-thread the caps, and tighten down with the Tekno wheel wrench. Once in place, hold the shock at a 45-degree angle with the bleed hole facing upwards, press the shock shaft so that it's all the way to the top, wiping away any excess oil, and at the top, while holding, insert the bleed screw into the cap until snug. Next, we need to pump the shock shaft up and down vigorously, around 20 times or so, in order to emulsify the oil. After which the shaft can be fully extended and the bleed screw removed, again facing upwards at an angle, and push the shaft all the way up again, wiping any excess oil if need be. And finally, tighten down the bleed screw until snug, and that's it, first shock fully prepared. After replicating the same process on the other shock, we have both front shocks complete. All that's left is to insert into the supplied springs. Insert a spring perch on the opposite end to hold it in place, and insert a screw to secure. Finally, insert a shock cap bushing into the shock cap, and we're ready to mount to the buggy. When mounting the shocks to the buggy, note that the slot in the spring perch should face the outside of the vehicle. So with that in mind, slide the shock cap onto the shock standoff and screw on a flanged lock nut to secure into place. I find it easy to hold the shock standoff with a wrench while tightening the nut down. The bottom of the shock is secured into the suspension arm, the inside hole being the stock position. Note that the silver screw is left-hand threaded and goes in on the right-hand side of the vehicle. Repeat on the opposite side, so lock nut up on the shock standoff, and 18mm shock mount screw on the lower inside hole, this one being black and right-hand threaded. And with that, our front shocks are complete. The rear shocks in bag M are slightly different to the front, so it's a good idea to build a set at a time rather than get them mixed up. The lower shock bushings are slightly longer, the springs are an orange rate, and the shock oil is slightly thinner, but otherwise the process in building them is exactly the same, so we won't cover the process all over again, and I've prepared them off camera instead. Again, we mount these onto the shock standoffs with a single nut, taking care to make sure the slot in the spring perch is facing outwards, and again using the black screw on the left side, and the silver screw on the right side of the buggy. And with that we are done. That's bags L and M complete, and both front and rear shocks mounted onto the vehicle. All feels perfectly fluid, and that's pretty much all the main parts of the vehicle built and complete now, and it is looking great so far. In the next part we move on to bag N, installing parts onto the main chassis ready for our electronics.